Okay, people, today we're gonna do week 21. Oh, shoot, wrong week 24, I'm pretty sure. And we are gonna be talking, we're creeping closer to events and decades that are super close in our memories or collective memory, and that we can personally attest to the effects of in our own lives. And we're going to be answering the question today, what was the long-term impact of the hippie movement? Although the hippie movement is often reduced to an aesthetic or fashion trend, its ideological implications really go far beyond the hippie aesthetic, and they ultimately remake and provide the second foundation of America. We can see how the hippie movement impacted us long term through how it transformed our morality and religion, relationship to the body, and our view of technology. So let's get started, because there's a lot to cover, and it's overall just a pretty cool topic. Love the hippies. Peace, love, and I don't know what else. So the hippie movement impacted modern religion and morality by embracing relativism and deontological ethics, which we're going to get into. But first, let's talk about the roots of the movement, which go back to Europe in the late 19th century, early 20th century, with a lot of social movements or social groups in Europe that were kind of proto-hippies. The Lebensreform was a German and Switzerland movement that really went back to nature and the earth and really focused on like raw foods and organic food and nudism, alternative medicine, sexual freedom, and they really were against like drugs, alcohol, all of that. So they were back to the earth hippies in the 1890s. Now, up to this time, the movements were always on the fringe, right? We have modernism going on, a lot of aesthetic of lines and rationality, and hippies are just kind of on the fringe at this point. But then the 1960s happened, and in this beautiful kind of wave and mixture of events, the youth kind of rebel against their parents' religion and morality in the 60s. And this combined with the expanding market, which allowed people and consumers to have more options, led to a hippie aesthetic. And a lot of things at this time were marketed towards teens and young people specifically. And this all leads to the rise of the hippies in kind of the mid-60s. 1965 can be seen as a pivotal year for this group and movement. And Dominic Sandbrook tells us that almost from the beginning, being a hippie was about an aesthetic. Everything from their food to what they decorated their houses with and flats with and their clothing all had a specific aesthetic. So that is how the hippie movement emerges. Now let's get into a little bit about the ethics behind the hippie movement. And I'm going to start with what a lot of people know, which is major themes in thought for the hippies. Open minds and unique ideas. Centers of community living for a good life. The idea that life is temporary and often filled with a lot of trouble and turbulation. The idea that we need to accept both good and bad parts of life. Focus on equality and pursuit of equality and personal freedom. Less mono-religious, like less conforming to one religion and more universal spirituality into practice. So a lot of hippies would have embraced like a lot of different Eastern spiritualities and stuff instead of just one singular religion. And then lastly, the idea that we need to live happy and be grateful in our life. So that's the major hippie thoughts. And now let's go into the kind of deontological ethics that come out. Neo-Kantianism, basically, and Rawlianism, and all that confusing stuff that I'm going to try to parse out. So, our brain transmits information in narrative form. When computers and the computer age comes along, technology suddenly has the ability to isolate facts from knowledge, and knowledge is transformed into information. Computers have the ability to have all this knowledge in encoding, and yet they still aren't the same as humans in the way they give out the knowledge. It's not in narrative form. They don't, like our technology today, Siri really can't have a really great conversation with you. And this leads to people saying there is a connection between knowledge and narrative. And humans respond to narratives, and that's how knowledge is transmitted. And people look at this and say, if humans are getting their knowledge through narrative form, every culture has a different narrative. So therefore, everyone's narratives and knowledge is different. And so this leads to the idea that there's all these different cultural narratives, and truth itself is very subjective. This leads to the idea of coexistence, right? We all have different beliefs, everyone has their own path. We all need to accept that and let everyone follow their own individual way. Society cannot hold it under this pressure. It will break down because you need some commonality and some common ground. If everyone in the society has a different narrative that they're listening to and different ideas about morality, then you really can't function as a society. And that is where the idea of Rawlianism comes in. John Rawls, he reintroduces Kant's ideas in a lot of ways and Kantianism. And one of his big ideas is if we're going to deal with social dilemmas and moral conundrums, we have to use the veil of ignorance to help us. Rawls calls this the veil of ignorance, according to Rawls, is the idea that when you make a decision, like a moral decision or solve a moral issue abstractly, you should think of yourself without knowing what position you are in the situation. So if you're trying to solve the issue, the moral dilemma, I don't know if you've heard, it's like the train dilemma where there's a train coming towards you and your kid is in the middle of the track and the train is moving toward the kid, and you can either switch the track away so it doesn't kill your kid but it kills all the people on the train, or you can save your kid. So that's a moral conundrum or whatever. And Rawls would say that you solve that with a veil of ignorance, not knowing what part of that equation you play. And that's how you should make your decision, if that makes sense. So that's Rawlianism, and really influenced by Kant. So if you look at Kantianism, you'll kind of understand Rawls' ideas. Go back. I talk about it in the first semester. So hippies believe a lot in individualism, obviously the coexisting, and in communities. There's a heavy focus on self-discovery. At the same time, there is this idea that community and like communal living is the way to a good life. And what's really interesting and how it affects Christians, in particular, the hippie movement filters down to Christianity and gives us the Jesus people who were hippie Christians. And a lot of the ideas from the hippie movement and the Jesus people affect how we do church today. In a lot of non-denominational churches, we can see the effects of the hippie movement. If your church uses contemporary like language and like slang, if your church focuses on contemporary lifestyle, politics, and relationships, if there is a heavy focus on extended musical worship, integration of popular music, a lot of physical expressiveness, informal clothing, use of like microphones, lights, all of that, you have been influenced by the Jesus movement and the hippies. So that's our first point. We're going to try to move on fast because that took a long time. And we're going to talk about how the hippie movement remade our relationship with our bodies. And we're going to look at drugs, alternative medicine, yoga, and hippie food. So Jerry Rubin of the hippie movement, in his Yippie Manifesto, he says, "We do not group with Christianity. The idea that people go to heaven after they are dead. We want heaven now." This idea plays into the drugs that were used in the hippie movement, people wanting to experience heaven and bliss on the earth through psychedelics, through using LSD and marijuana. And LSD provides hallucinations which can bring people to a place of enlightenment, and this idea that Jerry Rubin has that we want heaven now. Drugs kind of give you this bliss. And yeah, I love this quote from Timothy Leary, who says, "Turn on, tune in, drop out." So what he means by that is turn on to LSD, tune into the hippie movement, and then drop out of society. So there's this big influence of these two guys and a lot of other people that are saying that we should leave society behind and kind of self-discover. But this is problematic in a lot of ways, because when you leave society, live out in the woods, you're doing your LSD, your marijuana, it's great for a while, but after a while it's going to become lonely and isolating, and everyone's just focused on this self-pursuit, which, I mean, we see its effects today, right? Everyone being really a lot more lonely than they were, a lot less people in groups, and just everyone kind of out there self-discovering, and leads to a lot of loneliness and isolation. So another part of the relationship to our body that the hippies influenced was the alternative medicine. Oh, before I move on from this isolation and loneliness, we just need a quote from William Rohrbaugh, who says that personal autonomy created loneliness and isolation. Now we can talk about medicine. So the use of crystals and oils and home remedies and homeopathy. And going back to traditional medicinal like remedies rather than modern medicine, a lot of this is still super influential in like today. If you use essential oils, have crystals in your house, all of this is from the hippie movement. And now let's talk about food, because who doesn't like vegetables? Hippies influence our modern food a lot. Multi-grain bread, Whole Foods, Ben and Jerry's, rice bowls are just a few of the things they left us with. So hippies responded really strongly against the mass-produced foods that we talked about 2 weeks ago from World War II. They said, we don't want any of this. It didn't really fit in with their moral framework and all of that. So they wanted, like the Lebanese reformed people, to go back to natural foods and organic and raw. And people began experimenting in the hippie world. And they came up with a lot of weird foods that didn't really work, like this like broccoli rice casserole, a lot of mushy soy foods, and people were just testing it out. There was no information out there about health foods or like recipes and stuff at the time, so hippies were kind of making it up as they go, and a lot of their food wasn't great at first, but over time we can see that they obviously got better, because a lot of the food, or at least like health, non-processed food that we eat today and the recipes, come from the hippie movement. Ben and Jerry's, founded by hippies. Whole Foods, founded by hippies. And I don't want to get too into those because we don't have a lot of time. But we'll end with something from the Slow Food Manifesto. Slow food movement obviously is like farm to table stuff, focusing on promoting small businesses and sustainable foods and all that. And I'm just going to end point 2 by saying this from the Slow Food Manifesto. Let us rediscover the flavors and savors of regional cooking and banish the degrading effects of fast food. Okay, point number 3 is about technology. Although a lot of the early roots and a lot of the like 19th century, early 20th century movements were back to nature movements, in the 60s, the young people made technology a big part of the hippie movement and saw technology as an improvement for life. Along with like personal computers, we're also going to look at architectural structures. Silicon Valley, the heart of technology, is also super close to the city that is the heart of the hippies, which is San Francisco. And this is no coincidence. These Silicon Valley like technology people really related to the hippies. A lot of them actually were hippies. Stewart Brand. Why do I say it like that? Stewart Brand says that forget anti-war protests, Woodstock, even long hair. The real legacy of the 60s generation is the computer revolution. So, yeah, Stewart Brand. Oh my gosh, why can't I keep wanting to say Steve, but it's Stewart. Stewart tells us this, and yeah, their biggest impact, honestly, on today, we're using so much freaking technology today, is the personal computer that they gave us, which all started with phone phreaking, which was happening. These were kind of the earliest hackers. Phone freaking. Before our wireless system for telephones, the people used, like, obviously wired phones hang on the wall, and you would have to press the buttons to make your call, and the pressing those buttons would make the tones or whatever that would send the tones to the telephone company telling them you want to make the call. And phone phreakers hacked the system by whistling the tunes. They learned these simple tunes so they could not pay the telephone companies. And this network of phone phreakers and communities and the illegal technology they created leads to these communities that make our personal computers, communities and companies like Apple and Microsoft, which is kind of pretty awesome if you think about it. What else? Yeah, Steve Jobs. He was like a hippie. He used LSD, described it as an amazing experience. And all these people came from the hippie movement's roots in like Silicon Valley, San Fran area. And Chris Herron says that during the hippie movement of the 60s, Bay Area technology companies became more open-minded and embraced the open source movement of sharing ideas. Chris Herron also goes on to tell about how fast these companies developed. And yeah, that's how the hippie movement impacted our world today. Through their morality and religion, the idea of like coexisting, the idea of everyone has a deontology, and also Jesus people movement, our relationship with our bodies, all the drugs, the alternative medicines, and the food that they gave us, and then lastly, the freaking personal computer. So all of Apple, all of Microsoft, Google, all of that kind of hippies gave us. So thank you to the hippies. Big shout out. Peace to all of y'all out there. Go spread some love in the world today. And